In the first video, Hume's position on ideas and his definition of them, as well as the two kinds of truths that the human mind was capable of acquiring, which, to review, were matters of fact, where you have to have an experience, or relations of reason, where all you have to do is be able to analytically put together the two terms, such as bachelors are unmarried men, in order to know the truth of that proposition. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at Hume's critique of induction. Because of all the contributions which Hume makes to philosophy, his critique of induction would undoubtedly stand as the keystone of the arch of all of his other contributions. I apologize for the crudeness of the artwork, but that is all that PowerPoint allowed me. Anyway, according to philosophers, and this is certainly not something Hume denied, there are two kinds of inferential processes that the human mind is capable of engaging in: inductions and deductions. Induction goes from the experience of specific instances to abstracting or arriving at some kind of general or universal rule or law or understanding about the characteristics and properties of all the examined objects of that kind. This is true even in acquiring language. Linguists tell us that a child would not be able to apply a word properly unless it had at least some vague notion of what constitutes that kind of an object, say for instance a dog, and how it is different from another kind of object, say for instance a cat or a goldfish or something of that sort. Deduction is a process that works in just the reverse. It goes from a general or hopefully universal rule or law or principle or definition and applies it in specific instances. Now, it should be rather obvious that one cannot have deductions if one does not first of all have inductions. In the rules of deductions, say for instance the syllogism, one of the elements that has to be there is a universal proposition of some kind, whether affirmative or negative. And if the argument doesn't contain one or another of those, then automatically it would be considered invalid. Now, the reason why Hume considers inductions invalid is that according to him, all of them presume the constancy of natural law principle, which he states cannot be proven true by any kind of rational analysis. It's simply a kind of bald-faced assumption that a scientist or even a child learning language will make without any justification beyond their simply accepting it as true. However, this leads us to the question. And this is where Hume's position becomes self-defeating. The question is this: in what way does Hume determine that all inductions contain the constancy of natural law principle? From whence do we acquire this truth? Well, remember that for Hume there are two kinds of truths: relations of reason and matters of fact. Is this claim a relation of reason? That is it analytic in the same way that we know that a bachelor is an unmarried man? Well, that would seem not to work, because the notion of induction does not necessitate an immediate connection with the constancy of natural law principle, any more than the idea of the constancy of natural law principle immediately brings to mind induction. These can be spoken of totally separate and distinct from one another. This then leaves us with the other alternative. If it's not a relation of reason, then it must be a matter of fact. It must be a synthetic kind of proposition. But the truth of synthetic propositions require evidence. They require experience. Hume would have had to look at all kinds of intuitions in order to find in them the constancy of natural law principle. And so we can ask, did he examine each and every scientific intuition made in the past and future, finding in them this constancy of natural law principle? Well, it's kind of a silly question. Of course that's impossible. He couldn't have done that. So where then did he acquire this truth that all intuitions presume or assume the constancy of natural law principle? How does he know that all inductions, especially scientific ones, presume this constancy of natural law principle? Hume could only have inferred this by using the very kind of inductive process which he denies to others. And that is why his argument is self-defeating. You can't use induction as a process in order to prove that the process of induction is fallacious in some way or another, unless you are using some kind of theory of knowledge that rises above these concerns, something which Hume gives us not the slightest inkling of his ever doing. So here we can also add that for Hume to have been consistent in his argument, he would have had to employ a knowledge theory that defended induction as a legitimate and valid inferential process in his case, which, of course, he does not do. One of the reasons for these conundrums in Hume's theory of knowledge, I think, goes back to his elemental definition of ideas that he announced in the first part of the treatise. For him, remember, ideas were nothing more than words that were appended to a number of perceptions which one has. That is, those perceptions had become vague. They were kind of like memory residue in the mind. I sort of remember what Tom looked like and what Harry looked like and what all the other people that I have met looked like. And to that, I append the term man, or human, if I want to include Mary, Jane, and Susie Q in the batch. Now, one of the things that Hume tells us in the inquiry is that this idea of ideas, if you will, this definition of concepts in the human mind, was the great discovery of the 17th and 18th century, the great discovery of the modern period in philosophy. Well, for someone who was supposed to be as well-read as Hume, it's surprising that he didn't go back to someone like Peter Abelard, for instance, a 12th century logician, who had presented a position on ideas almost identical to the one that he claims was such a new and novel invention. This position was variously called in its time either moderate nominalism or conceptualism. And the thinkers of that period recognized that if that was what was going to be used by philosophers and especially theologians as the definition of ideas, then philosophy and theology were impossible. And that is why they looked for something else. And where did they find it? They found it in the abstraction theory of Aristotle. The great middle and late medieval thinkers inspired by them worked out Aristotle's theory of abstraction in even greater detail, and it continues on in the works of such people as Jean Poinceau in the 17th century and Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain in the 20th century. So for people who are a little lost in the vagaries of Hume, I might suggest they're looking at these writers for a way to get out of their philosophical maze.